I break everything. So many of you probably know that in March of this year, the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, he outlined that there was going to be a referendum on a right to housing held in 2023. And subsequent to that, then in November 2021, in anticipation of that, the government set up a commission on housing as part of its programme for government and housing for all policy. And one of the roles of the commission was to set up a subgroup who would look at the wording for a referendum. And the work on, when you look at, there's a particular website set up there for the Housing Commission. If you look on that website, it says that they're going to be around basically until around July 2023. However, if you look at some of the minutes of the meeting, they're all published on that website, and it states on the 1st of March minutes that the draft wording, they propose to have it ready for the autumn of this year. So you can pop onto that Housing Commission website, and what's actually happening at the minute is there's a public consultation. So that public consultation is opened, only opened I think on the 1st of July, and that's actually open until I think the 2nd of September. So at that point, or at this point now, anybody can make a submission to the Housing Commission, and it's quite important things that they're asking you to write to them about. So the first thing is whether or not you actually think an amendment to the Constitution is necessary at all. And the second thing then is, I suppose, what type of wording you would propose. So the first question is whether or not you think a referendum is necessary at all. So that's a very important question in my view. No, exactly, yeah. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is why is the referendum being proposed? Number 2, what protections does the Constitution currently afford a person with respect to their private property? Number 3, what will the proposed wording potentially look like? Number 4, what are the potential consequences if such a referendum is passed? And number 5, what actions can people take? So why is the referendum being proposed? So I think Michael alluded to the fact that the current wording is being proposed by Richard Boyd Barrett and a number of other TDs as a private member's bill. And the reason it is being proposed is because for, I'd say maybe since the 70s, different TDs have been trying to implement certain laws around restricting property rights, and at every turn, whatever government was in power, they did whatever they could to stifle the introduction of those laws. So what Richard Boyd Barrett is basically saying here in this Dáil debate, maybe this was actually when this is the leave to introduce the bill. What he was actually saying was that he doesn't believe that there's an impediment in the Constitution to introducing an awful lot of the laws they want to bring in to restrict property rights. That might be like rent restrictions or bans on evictions, that type of thing, or controlling the price of building land. It could be anything like that. But he says he doesn't believe there's an impediment in the Constitution to actually introducing those laws. But what he wants to do by introducing this amendment to the Constitution or referendum, he wants to take that argument away from the government. So, in relation to why the referendum is being proposed, to a certain degree it's important to step back a little bit, look back a number of years. So in, I think it was 1963, before 1963 we had very few restrictions on building, on planning permission, on zoning, on anything like that in Ireland. And in 1963 they introduced the Local Government Planning and Development Act. And then between 1963 and 1971, the price of building land, it actually just skyrocketed. Like I think in Dublin alone, the price between 1963 and 71, it increased by 530%. So then in 1971, the government said, oh God, what are we going to do now? Obviously, Milton Friedman says the government is the problem. The government introduced these laws to begin with, and that's what created the problem. That's what started this domino effect. So then they again said, what are we going to do now to solve this problem? So they went out and they commissioned this report that's known as the Kenny Report. And that particular committee, what they were tasked with, the question they were tasked with answering was, does the Constitution impose obstacles to the introduction of laws that would seek to control or regulate the price of building land? So what the government were seeing was that the price of building land was escalating in price. Before they introduced these laws in 1963, the price for agricultural land and building land, it was pretty similar because there was basically no planning permission, or there was no restrictions around what you could build or where you could build it. So they wanted to see what they could do at that point to cap or reduce the cost of building land. So the report then from the Kenny report, it made a number of recommendations, and this report is really important because throughout the years from the 70s onwards, so many TDs have referred to if they could actually implement the recommendations in the Kenny report, it would go somewhat towards resolving the housing and homeless crisis. Because I suppose it's one of the major factors when you're trying to develop housing or anything like that, is the cost of the land. So the principal conclusion from the majority in the Kenny report was that new legislation should be introduced to allow local authorities to compulsorily purchase land in specific areas called designated areas at existing land value use plus 25%, with the aim of reducing land costs for housing. So what they intended on doing was setting out particular areas in the country called designated areas, and what they wanted to do was local authorities, they would be able to compulsorily purchase land in those areas and either hold on to that land and sell it back to developers at a reduced cost, which would obviously feed back into how much people would have to pay for houses, or hold on to it themselves and build houses at some point into the future. So the question that arises then is, if the goal of the constitutional right to housing is to allow the government to comfortably implement the findings from the Kenny report, that's the first question. And if it's not, then what other type of measures does the government propose to introduce to vindicate a constitutional right to housing? So the Kenny report, when it came out in 1973, at the time, not long after that, the government changed. So the reasons, I suppose, the government said why it wasn't implemented, the government changed, then we went into a recession. Then a number of the pieces of legislation that they had relied on to make the finding that it would be constitutional to do this, to compulsorily purchase this land. A number of the pieces of legislation, like the Rent Restrictions Act, that was deemed unconstitutional, as was a piece of legislation that they relied on in Italy that was also deemed unconstitutional. So they kind of said it's on too shaky a ground to introduce this legislation. They were afraid, or at least they said they were afraid, that it would be found to be unconstitutional. But then, I suppose, in my mind, if you look at the case law from 1973 onwards for the last 50 years, it's very, very clear that the recommendations from the Kenny report, if they were implemented back then or if they were implemented now, it would be found by the courts to be constitutional, and we'll speak shortly as to why that is. So the question then arises is, why didn't they genuinely introduce those measures? And I suppose there are two, in my mind, there are only really two answers. The first one would be the preservation of wealth, their wealth and other people's wealth. Because if you look at TDs today, I think there's about a quarter of the TDs in the Dáil are landlords, and I think there's maybe a third of the Fianna Fáil TDs are landlords. So it's either trying to preserve their own wealth, or it's backhanders, brown envelopes, preserving the wealth of others. Because obviously, if you introduce these, these laws, whether or not it was rent restrictions or rent caps or zoning laws or further laws on planning permission, that was obviously going to reduce the wealth of people who owned that land. So that's the first, the short-sighted way of looking at it. And then the other, but I don't know myself now. The long game way of looking at it is that it was to facilitate an agenda some 50 or 60 years later of you will own nothing and you will be happy. Personally, I don't know that our government can think that far ahead, and some people might say that I'm naive in saying that. I think sometimes they can't think, as far as tomorrow, so never mind 50 or 60 years. But if they were setting in motion a train back in 1960 or 1970 that would escalate up into 2022 to a point where we have such a housing crisis, a homeless crisis, that people would actually say maybe this is the solution. But there, I suppose, the two trains of thought. My own opinion is that it's probably more likely to be preservation of wealth. So what protections does the Constitution currently afford you? So I know both Michael and Vincent referred to the delimitation of private property, and an awful lot of people tend to hang on this wording, but I think you're not acknowledging what the Constitution already says. So what it says is, the state acknowledges that man, in virtue of his rational being, has a natural right, antecedent to positive law, to the private ownership of external goods. The state accordingly guarantees to pass no law attempting to abolish the right to private ownership or the general right to transfer, bequeath or inherit property. People tend to stop there. What it says next is, the state recognises, however, that the exercise of the rights mentioned in the foregoing provisions of this article ought in civil society to be regulated by the principles of social justice. The state accordingly may, as occasion requires, delimit by law the exercise of the said right with a view to reconciling their exercise with the exigencies of the common good. So there's already a mechanism in there for the government to delimit your right to private property. And the one thing that people have to remember is when we're talking about private property, an awful lot of people just think, well, I don't own a house, that's not going to affect me. Private property is everything you own. So it's down to the wages that you get, that's how they can apply income tax. It's, you know, literally the clothes on your back, everything you own is property under the Constitution. So if they're talking about delimiting your right to private property, just because you don't own property, physical, a house or something, it doesn't mean that it's not going to affect you. So I suppose over the last 60 or so years, an awful lot of cases have gone before the courts, the High Court and the Supreme Court, in relation to what latitude the government has to introduce laws in the common good for the public interest. And what the Supreme Court has said is that the Constitution does not prevent the government from capping the price of building land, limiting compensation or rent, reducing land speculation or land hoarding, and other reforms of the planning and rezoning process. So the courts have already concluded that the Oireachtas already enjoys a wide discretion in relation to the restriction or extinguishment of property rights where such restriction is for the common good. So the third area that we look at is what will the proposed wording potentially look like. So as Michael said, there's currently before us, there's a bill that has been introduced by Richard Boyd Barrett. It's at the second stage. That's actually the third bill that has been introduced since 2017 on property rights. The first bill was also introduced by Richard Boyd Barrett and others, and it's identical to the one that's currently in the Dáil. So what the bill that's been proposed by Richard Boyd Barrett, so those articles of the Constitution that I read out, this would literally just be a follow-on. So what Richard Boyd Barrett wants to do is he wants to define what the common good is. So he intends to, or proposes to, introduce this additional wording which says the state in particular recognises the common good as including the right to secure, affordable, dignified housing appropriate to need for all the residents of Ireland, and shall guarantee this right through its laws, policies and the prioritisation of resources. The state accordingly shall limit or delimit the right to private property where it is necessary to ensure the common good and to vindicate the said right to housing for all residents of Ireland. So what he wants to introduce is a definition for what the common good is, and then he wants to introduce a right to secure, affordable, dignified housing appropriate to need for all the residents of Ireland. I'm not one bit concerned about this bill that Richard Boyd Barrett is trying to introduce. I think it's very much grandstanding. There's no way in the world that that's the wording that's going to be proposed. As we go through this video, you'll see that there's another group that you need to be far more concerned with, and far more concerned with the type of wording that they're looking to propose. Can you imagine, genuinely, irrespective of how many Marxists we have in this country, can you imagine if that type of wording came out? And I think it was something either that Michael or Vincent said, you know, we still are a country of homeowners. We still have, I think, is it 160,000 farmers. We know the type of difficulties that arise when there are disputes around farming and property and that type of thing. So we are still a country that values ownership of property. Can you imagine if a referendum came out that specifically said delimit the right to private property? I would imagine that there was probably a good number of people in the room already that didn't realise there was already wording in the Constitution that allows them to delimit the right to private property. So they don't need to put this wording in here. This wording screams out at the page at you. So they're not going to use this wording as far as I'm concerned. So we'll just look at maybe a little bit further back just to see what has happened over the last number of years and how we've gotten to this point. So as I said, in 1973 there was a report, the Kenny report, that looked at whether or not you could reduce the price of building land. In 1974 the Programme for Government and the then three-party coalition proposed a review of the Constitution to highlight areas where change was desirable. In 1996 the Constitutional Review Group published its report, with the final report dealing with property rights and suggested amendments. So this is what the 1996 Constitutional Review Group report stated. They wanted to introduce a new qualifying clause which would provide that such property rights, since they carry with them duties and responsibilities, may be subject to legal restrictions, conditions and formalities, provided they are duly required in the public interest and accord with the principles of social justice. Such restrictions, conditions and formalities may, in particular but not exclusively, relate to the raising of taxation and revenue, proper land use and planning controls, protections of the environment, consumer protection and the conservation of objects of archaeological and historical importance. That's what they wanted to introduce in 1996. Very, very wide reaching. So after the publication of that report by the Constitutional Review Group, the government established an all-party Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution, and between 1996 and 2007 that committee published 10 separate reports, with the final report in 2004 dealing specifically with property rights. In 2012, the government established a convention on the Constitution to consider a range of changes to the Constitution. The final topic which was covered was whether the Constitution should include for enhanced economic, social and cultural rights. So this Constitution, or this convention on the Constitution, is really important because it gives you a look into how the general public would potentially vote on a referendum like this. So this particular convention was made up of 99 citizens chosen at random, but at the same time, you know, they were looking at gender, they were looking at social class, education, and that type of thing. So there were 99 citizens in it and one chairperson. So the 8th report of the convention dealt with this economic, social and cultural rights, and this is the report that they produced at the time. So they asked the people in that convention, in principle, should the Constitution be amended to strengthen the protection of economic, social and cultural rights? 85% of the members of the convention said yes, and a further question was asked, in the event that the convention wishes to make recommendations on issues now, are there any specific additional rights that should be enumerated in the Constitution? 84% said housing. That gives you an idea into how people are likely to vote depending on how this is proposed to them. Then in 2016, the Dáil agreed to establish a special committee on housing and homelessness to identify how the obstacles that were impeding progress on housing and homelessness could be surmounted. So this is an extract from the report, and this goes towards explaining why this referendum on right to housing is not necessary. So this extract is a quote from Edmund Honehan. So he was the Master of the High Court from 2001 to 2022, just April of this year he retired. So this extract from the report says, addressing the committee on May 10th, Mr. Honehan expressed the view that politicians and lawyers are inclined to interpret things very differently, and that this has given rise to a misunderstanding of Article 43 and the jurisprudence relating to it. Whilst the Constitution does not contain any positive right to housing, noted Mr. Honehan, there really is no basis for suggesting that the common good does not include the provision of public housing. On this basis, he expressed disagreement before the committee for calls for constitutional change and a referendum. He said, I do not believe it is necessary to have a constitutional referendum because the common good requirement is such that it can be argued, and I have made the argument in relation to children, that society demands a paternal view of its role in regard to how we house people. That's the Master of the High Court telling you that if the point to this referendum is to confiscate or compulsorily purchase land from private individuals in order to build houses to resolve the housing crisis, he's saying this referendum is not necessary because they can already do that. So the question then is, as I think Michael said it, is what is the purpose behind this referendum if it's not just to take big swaths of land off people? Then in 2018, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, don't be fooled by their name, carried out a poll and found that 82% of persons believe that housing should be considered a human right. So 82% of people generally and 89% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that housing should be considered a human right. Obviously, as you go higher up in the age bracket, that percentage decreases because you're more likely to own property. Then in January 2020, a group called Home for Good, so this is the organisation that I was warning you about at the start, published a report titled For the Common Good, the Housing Crisis and a Proposal to Amend the Irish Constitution. Also in 2020, a joint committee on housing, local government and heritage was established. So you can see that basically from 1963 onwards, or maybe 1973 when the Kenny report was published, there have been steps, a number of steps taken up to this point with different committees, different reports, all around how do we solve the housing crisis. But they've never actually, I suppose, gone to the stage of actually introducing a referendum on a right to housing. And that's what it says to me, is that it was potentially that they were trying to preserve their own wealth as landlords or as developers, and they didn't want to introduce an awful lot of these laws. So I would, if you're going to do nothing else, when you leave this meeting, I would say just look up this organisation called Home for Good. Look up the report that they were published in January 2020, because I think this is the group that you need to be concerned about in relation to the type of wording that they would potentially be inserted into the Constitution. So what they said is that there's an obstacle in our Constitution. Our Constitution contains an overt protection of the right to private property while making no mention of a right to housing. In our Constitution, Article 43 protects private property and prevents the state from abolishing the right to private ownership or the right to transfer property. Article 43 recognises that the right to private property must be regulated in the interest of social justice and permits limits on the rights of the interest in the interest of the common good. So they're not happy with any type of limit. You know, they're talking specifically about abolishing property rights. They don't want to have to justify what they're doing either. A right to housing is not mentioned anywhere, nor is there any guidance in the text of the Constitution on how to balance the right to private property with the requirement of the common good. You wouldn't include guidance in the Constitution. That's not what it's there for. The courts have interpreted it over a period of 60 years. That's where the jurisprudence comes from. The courts have weighed up the right to the private ownership of goods of individuals with the common good for the community. Many of our neighbouring jurisdictions enshrine a right to housing in their laws or in their constitution. Ireland is an outlier among well-functioning democracies in not providing legal protection of the right to housing. Inserting a right to housing in our constitution will eliminate any doubt that property rights can be appropriately restricted to allow access to decent, affordable and secure housing for all. So you might remember Richard Boyd Barrett, he referred to residents. Home for Good are talking about for all. So then we also go into the area of, do we basically have an open borders policy in this country where we will not cap the number of refugees or economic migrants that we allow into this country, and if we end up with some kind of a referendum that allows for housing for all, what would that do to immigration? In November 2021, the government established a commission on housing, and one of the roles of the commission being the establishment of a subgroup tasked with examining the proposal for a referendum on right to housing. And as of March 2022, the Commission has confirmed that they expect to have the draft wording ready by the autumn of this year. So again, what would the proposed wording potentially look like? So I'm far more concerned with what this organisation, Home for Good, the type of wording that they will be proposing. So you can see just down at the very bottom of the right-hand side of that page there, the article that they want to introduce is, so it's what the Constitution currently states, and then it will be a new Article 43A. And this would be the wording they would propose. The state recognises and shall vindicate the right of all persons to have access to adequate housing. The state shall, through legislative and other measures, provide for the realisation of this right within its available resources. So that's why I'm saying I'm not concerned with the wording that Richard Boyd Barrett is proposing, because it jumps out of the page at you, it screams at you when you see that word delimit. This would achieve the exact same aim, except that it would be extended to all persons as opposed to all residents, but it would achieve the exact same aim because the delimitation of private property is already permitted through the Constitution. So you're far more likely to get wording like this passed because people, they don't see the word delimit. So you need to be far more concerned with this group and the wording that they're proposing. I have it on the next slide actually, yeah. So this is from their own website where they say in our Constitution, Article 43 protects private property and prevents the state from abolishing the right to the private ownership or the right to transfer. So they're talking about abolishing. They're concerned with the fact that you can't abolish property rights. So who they are the Simon Community, Focus Ireland, Respond, Cope, Galway and Threshold, and they're also the Mercy Law Centre. So a number of those organisations are government funded. The likes of the Simon Community, I just looked it up today, I think they get 50% of their funding from the government, as do Focus Ireland. I didn't look into the rest of them. The Mercy Law Centre, I think, only get a small portion of their funding from the government, though, from grants. So, you know, when you hear the words NGO, non-government organisation, what it actually means is government organisation. So what are the potential consequences if a referendum is passed? So as I said, over the last 60 years or so, there's been an awful lot of case law on the introduction of certain laws and people taking challenges to the court, and the court determining whether or not the right to private property prevails over the requirements of the common good. And the courts have determined exclusively that the Oireachtas already enjoys a wide discretion in relation to the regulation, control or extinguishment of property rights where such restriction is for the common good. So if a referendum on a right to housing is passed, it will mean that the already extensive powers of the Oireachtas to restrict property rights would be further extended, and there would be a positive requirement on the Oireachtas to vindicate the right to housing. And obviously noting in this context that the compulsory purchase of land is already permitted under the Constitution. So again, the question arises, why is this referendum necessary? What are they actually trying to achieve? So the final part is, I suppose, what actions can people take? So we're in the pre-bill stage. So when this public consultation, when it finishes, and this Commission on Housing, when they get the wording ready, and then the government decide whether or not they're happy with that wording, there's probably going to be a few debates over and back in the Dáil, then we'll have the final wording that will be proposed to the people. But at the moment, because we don't have the final wording, in my view, there's no point lobbying TDs and senators until you actually have the final wording. So what I would say is, right now it's an information war. It's getting as much information out to family and friends as you possibly can, you know, because as Vincent said, they're going to use the hard cases, and the hard cases are homelessness and the housing crisis, and they're also going to use baddies like vulture funds, billionaires, developers, and the problem is, if you fall into the trap of accepting that they can limit the property rights of certain people, once they've sufficiently drained those people of their resources, who do you think is next? They're not interested in the property developers or the vulture funds or the developers. They're not interested in those. They're not interested in their property. They're interested in your property. And if you believe that, don't fall into that trap of arguing their case for them by saying, yeah, it is okay, you know, you should introduce more laws to restrict vulture funds or developers. You're actually making their argument for them. So what I would say is that at the pre-bill stage, it's an information war. So right now it would just be educating family and friends, and also if you would be happy to make a submission to the Commission on why you think a referendum is not necessary. And if you want to go on to the ICHR, the Irish Council for Human Rights, there's a section there under campaigns where basically everything that I've gone through here today, and it's a lot longer version, I'm sure you'd be happy to hear, everything that has happened throughout all of the years is down there on one of those sections on a right to housing. So you can actually take snippets from that if you wanted to include it in your submission. So I would say make a submission to the Housing Commission and explain to them why you think a referendum on a right to housing is not necessary, if that's what you think. So that's the first stage. The second stage then is once the bill is published, at that point, that would be the point where you initiate a campaign to lobby TDs and senators and make it known to them that if they vote in favour of passing this bill, that they will lose your vote. But we have seen, I suppose, over the last 2 years that certain lobby campaigns haven't made a great deal of difference. So, like in my view, at that stage, we want to have an awful lot of leaflet campaigns. We want to have a lot of, you know, discussions like this, because even the what's the name of is it the commission, the referendum commission? Mm-hmm. The referendum commission, who's tasked with paid by the government, but independent, you know, who's tasked with, you know, providing both sides of the argument at referendum stage. Obviously, they're not going to do that. You know, if they're tasked by the government to make sure a referendum passes, they're going to make sure a referendum passes. So it's not going to be unbiased. It's not going to be fair. It's not going to be independent. So it's really important that we try and have meetings like this where people can ask questions and where it's a non-confrontational environment. You know, if there's any concerns about anything that's happening, that it can be raised. And then the final stage is when you come to the referendum stage. At that point, there's no point in lobbying TDs or senators anymore. It's back to an information war, making sure that your family, your friends understand what they will potentially lose if they give up, if they agree to a constitutional right to housing. And at that stage, we really need to be able to access the mainstream media. If we can't access the mainstream media at that stage, I would say potentially all is lost. Thank you.